I used to believe that silence was a form of grace, that if you carried yourself with dignity, people would eventually understand your worth without needing reminders. But silence can be misinterpreted. It can be mistaken for weakness, for poverty, for irrelevance. And in my case, it became the soil where other people's assumptions grew wild and unrestrained. When I moved into my son Evan's home in Utah, it was meant to be temporary. My knees had begun to stiffen during the colder months, and Evan had insisted I stay just until spring. Grace, my daughter-in-law, smiled through her teeth when she agreed. I tried to convince myself that the subtle tightening around her eyes wasn't resentment. I wanted to believe she cared. But deep down, the truth hummed like a faint warning I kept choosing not to hear. I had spent the better part of 72 years learning to manage my life quietly and independently. My late husband, Daniel, and I saved diligently, investing in land, mineral rights, and a few small businesses that eventually flourished. We were never flashy, not once. Our wealth was the kind that lived in documents, not in jewelry or cars. We kept to old habits, the kind forged during leaner times. Store away more than you show, save more than you spend, and never ever boast. After Daniel passed 14 years ago, I continued managing everything alone, as skillfully as any accountant would. I didn't realize that by keeping my finances private, I was setting the stage for people to assume I had nothing. The first signs of trouble were small, almost imperceptible. Grace rearranged my belongings without asking. A sweater would disappear into the donation pile. A framed picture of Daniel would be moved to a shelf I could never quite reach. Her comments came dressed as jokes, light, airy, but carrying the weight of condescension. "Oh, Mary, you don't need that old thing," she would say, as though age dissolved the importance of sentimental objects. Then came the dinner conversation where she spoke about tightening the household budget. She talked about unnecessary expenses, pausing deliberately as her gaze fell on me. Evan didn't seem to notice. He'd become accustomed to the subtle sharpness in her tone, the way small criticisms slithered into her sentences. But I felt it. A sting, faint but pointed. Something inside me tightened and I smiled through it. Over the next year, the atmosphere in the house shifted. My mail began to vanish, bank statements, property tax letters, notices from the credit union. Whenever I asked, Grace claimed she had no idea where they'd gone. It was easier to believe her than confront the unsettling possibility that someone was interfering with my privacy. I blamed myself for misplacing things, even though I was certain I hadn't. There was one particular evening that etched itself into my memory. I had been sitting quietly at the dining table, sewing the corner of a pillow that had begun to fray. My fingers moved slowly but steadily, a familiar rhythm that calmed me. I heard their hushed voices down the hall. They didn't know I was within earshot. Grace said, "Your mother's becoming a financial liability." Financial liability. The word struck me with such force that the needle slipped from my fingers and landed on the floor. Evan murmured something in response, something vague and non-committal, but the damage was done. My own son, the child I raised, taught, fed, sheltered, allowed the conversation to happen without correcting it. I sat there long after they had gone to bed, staring at the silver key hanging from my chain. It was small, unremarkable, the kind of key most people wouldn't notice. But it fit the safety deposit box I'd kept for over 35 years, where the truth of my financial life rested, meticulously organized. Investment documents, mineral rights, trust papers, statements that reflected decades of careful growth. And yet, in that house, under their assumptions, I had been reduced to a burden. The next morning, the atmosphere worsened. Grace hosted what she called a family meeting, which should have been my first sign that something was wrong. She arrived with a binder filled with glossy brochures, retirement homes, elder care facilities, long-term options. Evan looked tired, almost embarrassed, but he didn't oppose her. Not really. Not in any meaningful way. When she slid the binder across the table to me, she used a tone too gentle, too patronizing, as if she were speaking to a child. "We think it's time," she said. "Time for what? Time to be moved, tucked away, replaced by convenience?" I looked between the two of them and felt exactly how Daniel must have felt when negotiating a business deal. Quiet, calculating, patient. Anger wanted to rise in me, but I pushed it down. I needed clarity, not outrage. So I simply asked, "Is this what you want?" Evan swallowed hard, avoiding my eyes. Grace nodded. That was the moment something in me shifted. Not broken, no, not broken. Something awakened. A slow, patient fire, the kind that burns without smoke. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't beg to stay. I closed the binder gently and said, "If that's what you think is best." They mistook my calm for surrender. But I was making a decision, a quiet, deliberate one. Let them walk themselves into a story they believed they controlled. Let them reveal who they were when they thought I had nothing. For the first time in months, I felt the steady ground of my own strength returning beneath me. And as I returned to my room that evening, I touched the silver key again. They thought I was poor. They thought I was alone. They thought I was powerless. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. I began noticing the change in their behavior the way one notices a slow leak in a house, subtle at first, nearly invisible, until the damage has already been done. Grace grew bolder, more comfortable treating me as though I were an aging inconvenience occupying space she wished were empty. Evan grew quieter, retreating behind a wall of exhaustion and willful ignorance. Their attitudes didn't shift overnight. They accumulated in layers, each one thin but suffocating, until I realized I could no longer breathe normally in my own home. The first major betrayal came one quiet morning when I went to retrieve Daniel's watch from my bedside drawer. I had kept that watch for decades, polished it gently every year on our anniversary. It was the only piece of jewelry I brought with me into Evan's house. But that morning the drawer felt too light. My hand searched, then searched again, then froze. The watch was gone. When I asked Grace if she had seen it, she didn't even bother looking sympathetic. She simply laughed softly and said, "Mary, you really need to keep track of your things. You can't keep losing everything. It's not safe." The implication struck me harder than the loss itself. Not only had she taken something precious, she wanted me to believe I'd misplaced it, that my mind was slipping. Later that week, I accidentally came across a listing online. A Goldman's watch, vintage, with the exact engraving on the back. Same scratches. Same wear on the strap. Same model Daniel had worn every day for 38 years. The seller was a friend of Grace's. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore. I saved the listing, printed the page, and slipped it into a folder I kept hidden at the back of my closet. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I wanted the truth to build until it became undeniable. The second betrayal arrived in the form of a call from my credit union. A polite representative informed me that someone had attempted to update the access permissions on my accounts. My heart tightened. When I asked for the name listed on the request, the representative hesitated before quietly telling me it was Grace. I asked for proof. He emailed me a scanned copy of the request. Her handwriting, her shaky signature, her blatant attempt to reach into a place she had no right to be. Again, I didn't confront her. I printed the document, placed it behind the page of the watch listing, and closed the folder. Patience, I reminded myself, has always been my strongest asset. The third betrayal was the most brazen of all. Grace called another family meeting. This time with a tone so falsely sweet it nearly made my stomach churn. She had expanded her binder, color-coded tabs, financial projections, pamphlets detailing affordable care options. She spoke as though decisions had already been made without me, as though I were a silent occupant rather than a participant. "We found a really good facility," she said. "They specialize in elders with declining abilities." Declining abilities. The word stung more than I expected. I could feel my hands tremble, not out of fear, but out of the rage I worked hard to keep contained beneath a calm surface. Evan sat beside her, nodding occasionally, though he could not meet my eyes. That, more than anything, told me he knew it was wrong. Yet he said nothing. They laid out the plan as if I were not even present. My belongings would be sorted. The house could be repurposed. My care would be delegated to strangers behind locked doors and scheduled routines. They had planned my removal from their lives with the cold precision of people reorganizing a closet. But I didn't show anger. Not a flicker. I simply folded my hands in my lap and listened until they were done. When Grace asked, "So what do you think?" I responded with the same quiet, unwavering tone. "If that's what you believe is necessary, then go ahead." I saw certainty flood her expression. Ugly, triumphant certainty. I saw relief soften Evans. They truly believed they had broken me down to compliance. And in that moment I knew the time had come to stop observing and start preparing. That evening, after they retreated upstairs, laughing softly about some future vacation they hoped to plan once things were settled, I retrieved the silver key from my drawer and pressed it between my palms. Its cool weight steadied me. The safety deposit box it belonged to contained my life story, the truth I had protected for decades. Investments, deeds, property titles, trust records, even shares Daniel had purchased long ago in a now successful company. Everything was catalogued with meticulous precision. They assumed I had nothing. They assumed I would leave quietly. That assumption would become the root of their humiliation. I spent the next 2 days gathering evidence. I photographed the empty drawer where Daniel's watch had once been. I printed more copies of the bank form. I documented every brochure from the retirement home binder. I neatly labeled each section of my folder, not because I needed organization, but because I wanted everything ready for the moment the truth required undeniable clarity. During those days, Grace's confidence began to swell. She moved through the house with a sense of ownership, as though I were already gone. She criticized the way I folded laundry, the way I cooked my meals, even the way I took up space. It was as though telling me I was a burden had become her daily ritual. Evan wasn't cruel, never deliberately, but he was weak. He let Grace shape the narrative. He let her voice speak louder than his conscience. And yet, a part of me still believed he might remember who raised him, who sacrificed for him, who never once asked him for anything until now. One morning as I sat at the kitchen table sipping tea, I overheard them discussing how selling the house would work once everything was finalized. How they could use the proceeds for better opportunities. Grace mentioned remodeling, repainting, transforming the place completely. She had no idea the deed was in my name. No idea the trust named me sole owner. No idea that her future plans were about to collapse like a sandcastle in a rising tide. Their ignorance was breathtaking. Their entitlement was astonishing. And as I listened, something inside me settled into place. A resolve so steady it felt like iron forming in my spine. They thought they understood who I was. They thought they knew my limits. They thought they had taken everything from me. What they didn't realize was that their betrayals had not weakened me. They had empowered me. And soon they would regret every assumption they had ever made. Once the decision settled inside me, it brought an unexpected calm. Not relief, clarity. The kind that comes when you finally stop negotiating with disappointment and begin planning with purpose. I stopped reacting to Grace's tone, her glances, her small humiliations. Instead, I observed. I listened. I waited. Every word she spoke became another thread in the tapestry she was weaving around herself, tightening without her noticing. The call from my accountant came sooner than I expected. His voice carried the familiar steadiness I had relied on for decades, but there was urgency beneath it. He said he needed to review my trust structure, that some long-term holdings had matured far beyond their original projections. He suggested a formal meeting. I told him I would let him know when's exact day. When he asked if my family would be involved, I paused before answering. That pause said more than words ever could. He understood. He always did. After that call, I began my preparations quietly. I retrieved the folder from the back of my closet and added to it with deliberate care. I placed the printed listing of Daniel's watch at the front, followed by the bank documents Grace had submitted without my consent. Behind those, I added copies of the property deed, the trust summary, and the investment statements that showed decades of growth. Each page was a mirror, reflecting the truth they had refused to see. I also chose 3 objects to carry with me when the moment came. Daniel's photograph, the one taken the summer before he passed, where his smile still held certainty. The silver key worn smooth from years of being carried close to my heart. And a faded photograph of Evan as a child, standing barefoot in our first home, his hand wrapped around mine. These weren't weapons. They were reminders of who I was, what I had built, and why this mattered. Grace grew increasingly impatient as the days passed. She asked pointed questions about when I would start touring facilities. She made comments about downsizing my wardrobe, about donating my books, about preparing for the transition. Each remark was delivered with the confidence of someone who believed the ending had already been written. Evan, on the other hand, began to show cracks. I noticed the way his eyes lingered on me longer than usual, the way his voice softened when he asked if I needed anything. Once he even started to say something, stopped himself mid-sentence, then walked away. Guilt hovered around him like a shadow he couldn't shake, but he still didn't speak. Silence, I was learning, could be a form of betrayal too. One afternoon, Grace crossed a line she hadn't crossed before. She began sorting through my belongings without permission, stacking boxes labeled keep and donate in the hallway. When I asked her to stop, she smiled thinly and said, "It's just easier if we do this now." As if my life were already in the past tense. That night I packed a small bag. Not to leave, but to remind myself that I could. Independence has a way of strengthening resolve. I slept better than I had in months. The following morning, I called my accountant back and scheduled the meeting. I requested a full disclosure, complete documentation, and witnesses present. When he asked if I was certain, I told him I had never been more certain of anything in my life. He said he would prepare everything thoroughly. Then I told Evan and Grace there would be a financial review. I kept my tone neutral, almost casual. Grace's interest ignited immediately. She asked questions, too many, too eager. Evan looked uneasy, but he agreed to attend. Neither of them asked what the review was about. They assumed, as always, that it concerned managing what little they believed I had left. In the days leading up to the meeting, I noticed Grace growing anxious beneath her confidence. She began asking Evan about the house, about future plans, about timelines. She talked too much. People do that when they sense the ground shifting but don't yet know why. On the morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully. Nothing extravagant. A simple blouse, pressed slacks, Daniel's old cardigan folded over my arm. I slipped the silver key into my pocket and placed the folder in my bag. My hands were steady. My reflection in the mirror surprised me, not because I looked older but because I looked resolved. As we drove to the office, the silence in the car was heavy. Grace checked her phone repeatedly. Evan stared straight ahead, jaw tight. I watched the familiar Utah landscape pass by, mountains standing firm in the distance, unchanged by the small dramas of human lives. That steadiness comforted me. When we arrived, the receptionist greeted us warmly and mentioned that my accountant had already prepared the complete asset summary. Grace's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. She recovered quickly, but I saw it, the flicker of uncertainty, the first crack in the certainty she had worn like armor. As we waited to be called in, Evan finally looked at me and asked quietly if this meeting was really necessary. I met his gaze and answered honestly. "Yes," I said. "It's time." He nodded, though his expression suggested he was no longer sure what that meant. When the door opened and we were invited inside, I took a breath and stepped forward. The folder felt heavier than paper in my bag. It carried years of silence, restraint, and underestimated strength. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This story would no longer be told for me. I was ready to tell it myself. The conference room was brighter than I expected. Glass walls reflecting a version of us that felt strangely exposed. We took our seats around the long polished table, Grace positioning herself closest to my accountant as if proximity alone could grant authority. Evan sat beside her, shoulders tense, hands folded so tightly his knuckles blanched. I placed my bag carefully at my feet and rested my hands on the table, steady, open, unafraid. My accountant greeted us and began by explaining the purpose of the meeting. A full financial review, complete transparency, and updated documentation. Grace nodded along too quickly, the way people do when they believe they already understand what's coming. Evan listened silently, eyes darting between us. I could see questions forming behind his expression, but years of habit kept him quiet. When the first folder was opened, the atmosphere shifted. Pages were turned slowly, deliberately. Property titles appeared. Addresses Evan recognized but had never questioned. Investment summaries followed, neat columns of numbers climbing steadily over decades. Mineral rights agreements surfaced, land parcels I had purchased long before Grace ever entered our lives. Each document landed like a weight on the table, accumulating, undeniable. Grace's smile thinned. "There must be some mistake," she said lightly. "Mom always said she didn't have much." I looked at her, then really looked at her, and answered calmly. "I never said that. You assumed." The room went quiet. Evan leaned forward, scanning the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. He looked up at me, confusion giving way to disbelief. "Mom, Why didn't you tell us? Because you never asked, I replied. And because my finances were never your concern. My accountant continued, outlining totals, valuations, long-term growth. The number at the bottom of the page made Grace's breath catch audibly. Her fingers curled into the edge of the table. Evan sat back, stunned, as if the ground beneath his understanding had shifted without warning. Then I reached into my bag and placed the first piece of evidence on the table. A printed image of Daniel's watch listed for sale, the engraving clearly visible. I'd like to talk about this, I said. Grace opened her mouth but no sound came out. Evan stared at the page, recognition flashing across his face. That's Dad's watch, he said quietly. Yes, I answered. The one that went missing from my drawer. Grace tried to speak, to explain, to deflect, but the words tangled in her throat. I placed the second document down, the bank form requesting access to my accounts, her handwriting unmistakable. My accountant confirmed its authenticity. Evan's face drained of color. You told me you were just helping, he said to her, voice breaking. You told me Mom was confused. Grace finally raised her voice, then defensive, sharp. I was protecting us. She doesn't even understand what she has. I met her gaze without flinching. I understood it well enough to build it, I said. And well enough to protect it from you. The final item I placed on the table was the binder. The one she had brought to me with retirement home brochures, care plans, timelines for my removal from the house. I slid it toward Evan. He opened it slowly, realization dawning as he flipped through the pages. You planned all this, he said, looking at Grace. Without talking to her. Without talking to me. She looked around the room as if searching for an ally but found none. Even the staff beyond the glass walls had paused, their attention drawn by the tension radiating from the room. Grace's confidence crumbled under the weight of exposure. My accountant cleared his throat and explained the final matter, the updated trust. He described the changes I had made, the safeguards put in place, the removal of anyone who had attempted unauthorized access to my assets. Grace's face contorted in disbelief. You cut me out, she whispered. I protected myself, I replied. There's a difference. He also clarified something Grace had never known, the house. The deed was in my name, held through a trust established years before Evan married. The home she had claimed, reorganized, and planned to profit from was never hers to control. Evan buried his face in his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. Mom, he said, voice unsteady. I didn't know. I should have known. I should have listened. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. You chose comfort over courage, I said gently. But you're here now. That matters. Grace stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. So what now? She demanded. You embarrass me like this and just walk away? I considered her for a long moment before answering. What happens now, I said, is accountability. My accountant outlined the consequences. Legal protections, restrictions, documentation forwarded where necessary. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cruel. Just the truth structured and enforced. As we gathered our things, the room felt different, lighter somehow. Evan lingered, eyes searching mine. What do you want me to do? He asked softly. I took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something solid and real. I want honesty, I said. And I want respect. Everything else we'll see. We walked out together, but not as we had walked in. Something had been broken open, exposed to the light. Grace stayed behind, gathering her things with shaking hands. Evan followed me, silent, thoughtful, changed. For the first time in a long while I felt seen, not as a burden, not as an afterthought, but as a woman who had built something worth defending. And the truth, once released, could never be taken back. The days that followed the meeting passed with an unfamiliar stillness, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Grace moved through the rooms like a ghost, quiet and withdrawn, no longer issuing instructions or opinions. The confidence that once filled her posture had collapsed inward, leaving behind a brittle silence. Evan, on the other hand, tried, awkwardly at first, to bridge the distance he had allowed to grow between us. He made tea in the mornings, asked if I needed anything, lingered in the doorway of my room as if searching for words that never quite came. I didn't rush him. Some lessons need time to settle. The The legal consequences unfolded calmly, without drama. My accountant ensured that all documentation was secured, my accounts locked down, my trust updated beyond dispute. Grace's attempt to access my finances was formally recorded, and while I chose not to pursue harsher action, the boundaries were now unmistakable. She could no longer touch anything that belonged to me, financially or otherwise. One evening, Evan sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where they had once discussed my future as though I weren't there. He looked smaller, somehow humbled. "I let her speak for me," he said quietly. "I let her decide things that weren't hers to decide." I nodded, stirring my tea. "You let fear make you comfortable," I replied. "It happens more often than people like to admit." Grace left the house a week later, saying she needed time to think. She packed quickly, avoiding eye contact, her movements sharp and defensive. There were no apologies, only wounded pride. I watched from the window as she drove away, not with triumph, but with a steady sense of closure. Some relationships don't end with reconciliation. Some end with clarity. After she left, Evan and I talked more openly than we had in years. He asked questions not about money but about my life. About Daniel. About how I had built everything so quietly. I told him stories I hadn't shared in decades, not to impress him, but to remind him that strength doesn't always announce itself. A month later, I moved into a small cottage community near the foothills. The place was modest, sunlit, peaceful. No one there knew the value of my assets, and for the first time that secrecy felt like a gift rather than a shield. My neighbors knew me for my garden, my habit of early morning walks, the way I waved to everyone I passed. I was simply Mary again. Evan helped me settle in. On his last trip, he handed me a faded photograph he had found while packing up the house. Him at 6 years old, standing barefoot beside me, holding my hand in front of our first home. "I forgot how strong you always were," he said softly. I smiled. "I never stopped being strong," I replied. "You just stopped looking." Our relationship didn't repair itself overnight, but it began again, on new terms, grounded in respect rather than assumption. He visited often, called more, listened better. And I let him because accountability doesn't have to end in exile. Sometimes it ends in growth. As for Grace, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she struggled with the fallout. People began to see her differently once the truth emerged. Reputation, I learned, is fragile when built on entitlement. I didn't feel satisfaction in her discomfort, only a quiet affirmation that actions eventually speak for themselves. In the evenings, I often sit on my porch with a cup of tea, Daniel's photograph resting beside me. I think about how close I came to being erased from my own story, reduced to an inconvenience, dismissed because I chose humility over display. I think about how easily people mistake silence for emptiness. What I've learned is this: dignity does not require permission. Boundaries are not punishments, they are protections. An age does not diminish worth, it clarifies it. They thought I was poor because I didn't perform wealth for them. They thought I was weak because I didn't argue. They thought I would disappear quietly because I had been kind. They were wrong. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't seek revenge in the way they expected. I simply told the truth, and let it stand where lies once lived. In doing so, I reclaimed something far more valuable than money. I reclaimed myself.